develop our discussions among us, between us, and with the class by a dialogic method. I'm going to begin saying things step by step, and then ask Michael to comment and develop his slides, and then we'll open it up to you as we go along. So let's go back a step first and begin with what philosophy is and what religion is. I did say something about the nature of philosophy and what it has been historically, but I did not yet say anything about religion. So philosophy in the tradition of the West has been, I claim, a super science, and a super science in the service of self-help. Each of the great philosophers profess to have a system, an account of the nature of ultimate reality and of our place in the world. And this account was above all the specialized disciplines. That's why I'm calling it a super science. It did not invoke the methods or the authorities of particular disciplines. Even a philosopher like Aristotle, who was concerned with the empirical details of different domains of being and of knowledge, developed his philosophy in this style. There was, at the center of the philosophy, a metaphysics, and the metaphysics was the account of the fundamental nature of reality, and then there was an extension, a development of that account in the context of the particular disciplines. That idea of philosophy has fallen into disrepute and consequently into disuse because of the difficulty of answering a fundamental question. How does the philosopher, the super scientist, know that all these things that he claims are true? He must appeal to some special form of knowledge, some privileged experience, and in the absence of a convincing demonstration of what that prerogative is, it seems to be just dogma or invention. Then philosophy has shrunken into something much narrower in certain parts of the world. It has become what I call a thought police, in which its objective is to determine the rights and wrongs of different forms of argument. And this has been a disaster in the history of philosophy, because the thought police is of little interest to humanity or even to the scientists and thinkers in different disciplines. So the exponents of the thought police end up speaking mainly to one another and fail to arouse the interest of the rest of mankind. So what's the conception of philosophy that at least I, in my intervention to this argument, will try to exemplify? And I said it's the idea of the mind at war, in which its premise is refusing to take as definitive the claims and prerogatives of the different disciplines. So then we think that our insight is not confined to what we know as specialists in different disciplines, but we retain a residue of extra insight, of transcendent insight. We are able to turn the methods of the disciplines against themselves and affirm in thought the general character of humanity, which is, it combines finitude with transcendence. And philosophy is the cognitive exemplification of this. Would you like to comment, Michael?
Not yet. What I would say is please keep going. This is wonderful.
Yes. So I am attempting in my interventions here to exemplify a third conception of the vocation of philosophy. Philosophy is an attempt to insist on our prerogative to speak about what matters most. at the limits of the almost thinkable, of the almost unthinkable, and the almost unsayable. Not because we appeal to some higher level from which we can pass judgment on what the particular disciplines claim, but because we refuse to allow the particular disciplines in their present form to monopolize the prerogatives of thought. And we dispute often their claims to account for their own area. This is the revisionist conception of philosophy. And I want to exemplify it here in dealing with religion. Now, what about religion? What is religion? Religion has been different things in the history of mankind. So it's foolish to deny the historical character of the category and to insist that it has a permanent essence. But ever since religion ceased to be mainly preoccupied with our dependence on nature, with the terrors of nature, the religions have become something which we can attempt to describe as having a common element. And what then is this common element? The crucial criterion for an acceptable definition of religion is that it be sufficiently encompassing to include, at a minimum, the Eastern visions of the world, especially Buddhism and Confucianism, but at the same time retain a distinction from philosophy. So, in the first place, religion is a vision of the world and of our place in it. That deals, that proposes to us, that has the consequence of engaging us in an orientation to existence. It has practical consequences for how we are to live. And already this requires a commentary, because one of the most common tenets in the development of modern philosophy is the one that Hume immortalized in the treatise on human nature, when he said, we cannot derive ought propositions from is propositions. In any argument, he says, we come to a moment in which suddenly we switch from the is to the ought, and this switch is unfounded. Now, what I want to say by way of elucidating the concept of religion is that this is a logical point about particular propositions. Prescriptive propositions cannot be derived from descriptive propositions. But the more comprehensive our ideas, the less this distinction between the descriptive and the normative has force. As our conception of ourselves and the world become more comprehensive, the distinction between the normative and the descriptive begins to crumble. And what do I offer as a demonstration or an argument for this point? The very work in which Hume made the point, his treatise on human nature. Because in his treatise on human nature, he has an extended description of what we are like as human beings and of our position in the world. And then he argues for a particular ethical orientation on the basis of this description. And that, I'm saying, is what always happens. So the methodological or logical distinction between the normative and the descriptive breaks down as our ideas become more comprehensive. And the domain in which that breakdown can be observed observe most manifestly is the domain of religions. Because all of these religions present to us an account of the world or of our place in it, but in such a way that the account seems to have immediately existential consequences, consequences for how we are to live. Second characteristic of religion, as it has developed after this main theme ceased to be our dependence on nature, its powers and its terrors, is that all religions are responses to what in the first class we call the irreparable flaws in the human condition. Our mortality, our groundlessness, and our insatiability. Their central theme has ceased to be the power of nature over us, and it has become our mortality, our failure of, our inability to determine the framework of being in existence, and our insatiability. A third characteristic of the religions is that they refuse to be cabined in a particular domain of human life. A religious view, a religious orientation to the world demands to penetrate every part of our lives, personal and collective. It refuses to be limited to any specific department of human existence. From this standpoint, Protestantism, the religion of Reformed Christianity in the 18th and 19th century, is an exception, an anomaly in the history of religion, because that particular religion was privatized, a privatization of the sublime. And that's the religion that has exerted the greatest influence on the United States. The Protestantism of the 18th and 19th century. The Protestantism of Madison, of Schleiermacher. This privatized Protestantism of the individual conscience in transaction with God. But the normal form of religion, of these religions that we're dealing with here, is that they want to shape everything in human life. And they refuse to be limited to any department of existence. Now, a fourth characteristic of religion, or a fifth, fourth and the fifth, is that it requires from us faith in two distinct senses. The first sense has to do with our account of the world and of human life in the world. We have to commit ourselves or our existence in a particular direction. We can justify our commitments to a particular vision or a particular orientation. We can give arguments for them or against them, but it seems that the most important decision that we have to make, which is what are we to do with our lives and what direction are we to live in, requires justifications that never turn out to be strong enough. The commitment always overreaches the justifications that we provide for it. There's an unavoidable cognitive overreach. It's not that we can't present arguments in favor and against particular orientations to life. It's the arguments always seem to be disproportionate to the conclusions that we want to draw from. Why is it that the most important decisions that we have to make are decisions that seem to demand, by way of foundations, more than we can ever produce? So that's the first core sense of faith. that our commitment overreaches its justification. And it overreaches, as it were, inevitably, rather than just contingently. And the second sense of faith is that as we commit ourselves in a way which inevitably overreaches the reasons that we have for our commitment, we make ourselves vulnerable to other people. So this elective vulnerability that arises from the cognitive overreach of faith is the second sense of faith. Faith as fides, as trust. And I want to argue later on in the course, and indeed throughout the course, for always an ethic that takes it as a central thesis of moral wisdom, that we unprotect ourselves. And now let me jump ahead and relate this to a continuing argument in the course. There are two conceptions, or two families of conceptions of happiness in the history of moral ideas. There is a conception that happiness is the privation of suffering. It's a negative conception. And that's the conception that we have in the orientation to life, the overcoming of the world that we'll discuss next week. And in philosophers in the West who represented this conception, like Schopenhauer. The second family of ideas is that happiness consists in fullness of experience, in the development of powers, of capability, the capability to live, the possession of life, variety and fullness of experience. And this second kind of happiness inevitably involves conflict, contradiction, and therefore also suffering. So it's incompatible with that first conception of happiness. It goes beyond it. And it then presents to us this task, which I'm claiming is the essence of wisdom, for those who embrace the second conception of happiness. That the essence of wisdom, of existential wisdom, is to unprotect yourself. That that's the threshold that we must cross to come into the possession of life. And it directly contradicts the wisdom of the ancients, the ancient Greek eudaimonism, as it's called, the doctrine of happiness. That the secret of happiness is not to depend on faith. The self must make itself into a fortress. It must steel itself against the threats that come from the outside. And that's the way in which we become happy. Even when we accept the second family of ideas about happiness, that happiness is not just negative, not the privation of suffering, and advance to the second family, that happiness is fullness of experience. We face these threats that come from every side in the world. And we should become as indifferent as possible to them. This view contrasts with the opposing view, which I just invoked, that the only way in which we can live and take possession of life is to cast down our shields, that that's the condition of vitality. Michael?
Please keep going. This is wonderful.
No, I want your comment now.
Absolutely. So let me say just a few words of comment to Roberto's points and then point toward where we'll be going very soon. So in terms of comment, note what Roberto was doing in setting up these arguments. He is already setting up a contrast from our readings of today, which are very much, as we will be exploring more fully momentarily, radically delimiting what philosophy can do, and doing so in a way that would cut out any possible connection to religion. And what Roberto was doing at the very beginning of the class is giving us an expansive vision of both philosophy and religion, and calling on us to break from one of the many implications that come from the delimited, very domesticated versions that have become dominant today. In terms of philosophy, as he's already laying out, and we will see, we'll be exploring much more fully over the course of the semester, the argument will be a philosophical vision that will force us to challenge most of our assumptions, radically rethink the world around us, but without any easy possible answers that will be given toward what this will mean, or even, as we will see much more further into the class, any clear sense of what kind of a salvation awaits us with this work. The work, in other words, is a philosophical work that is based upon challenging, rethinking one's assumptions, rethinking the world, without the pre-given sense of some kind of a stable cosmos, some kind of a stable vision, some kind of a stable normative criteria that could guide us. And he's making the further move of saying, to do so, we will be building upon great religious visions from the world, again, taking out the tendency of many of these religions to give us some kind of a sense of what we're going to be seeing out of the work we will be doing, and yet the power that you have in religious traditions is they are willing to confront our assumptions. They are calling on us to do this extraordinary work. But again, from the philosophical side, we will be pushing against any pre-given answer that could possibly be given to the kinds of work we are doing.
So let me try to sharpen my
Yes.
one step more, the contrast that I was suggesting. The central proposition of the ethical wisdom of the ancients in the Greek eudaimonism was, stay out of trouble. And the central proposition of the world that was created by Christianity and Romanticism was, look for trouble. And so it couldn't be sharper, the contrast of views. But that's exactly the contrast which is presented in the history of our moral ideas.
Yes, yes.
Because, and to look for trouble, of course, means to make oneself vulnerable. And vulnerability is the door to life. That's how we take possession of life in the present moment and make ourselves bigger. And that's then the central fulcrum of dispute in the moral ideas of humanity over the last few centuries. I could hardly make a broader claim than that. That's the claim I'm making.
Oh, just you wait, he'll make many such broad claims.
So would someone like to comment at this
Yes, let's
early
open this
point?
up.
Now, of course, we know that if you just take the dominant political ideas, say the ideas of social democracy or social liberalism, they emphasize the creation of havens. And this is a limitation of progressive politics. It has ideas about distribution and entitlements, but it has no ideas about production. And a critic, the kind of critic which I would argue we need, would say, it's not enough to have a doctrine about the havens, the protection against the insecurities, the risks of the market. It's necessary to have a doctrine about the storm of innovation, of creation, of production that should rage around the havens. The storm doesn't take care of itself. The storm is not automatic. the store needs to be arranged. And therefore, we need a doctrine of the market and democracy that arranges the store, that makes the store happen, but shapes it in a certain way. Now, it might seem that this claim that I've made about ethics is in direct conflict with this political idea. It is in a sense and not in a sense. So we have to make ourselves vulnerable. But if we are protected against the risks of want, of famine, of ill health, if we have fundamental protections, it may be easier to make ourselves vulnerable to the intangible elements in our existence. So there's not necessarily a contradiction. The emphasis on the havens may be compatible with the ethical imperative of accepting vulnerability. No?
I absolutely agree, and we will come back to this repeatedly in the course. Roberto was just mentioning the degree to which, if you go back to classical Western, in this case Greek and Roman conceptions, the idea was you have a structured cosmos. Insofar as you have a structured cosmos, you would develop an ethics and a philosophical vision of how to live properly within that structure. We might like to think, yes, but none of us believe that anymore. We will see repeatedly, whether we claim to believe it or not, we kind of do, or much more importantly, by the sorts of social structures we live in and take for granted, we've largely recreated that exact vision. And the result, as we will see, is we very, and I don't mean this in a good way, can easily translate a lot of ethical visions based upon the idea that the world is already pre-structured for us. They translate very well in a largely secular version because we sadly accept most of these. If we really wanted to take seriously that, no, most of our senses of a pre-given structure are those that we have created without accepting that we have created them. If we have, however, created them, they could be changed. If we have created them, we have probably created them very badly. And the assumption that therefore they are pre-given and are unchangeable has got to be stopped, which means how and why did we gain such a sense of a pre-given structure? What in the world would it mean to break them down? In terms of the self, what would it mean to develop a self that would be, as Roberto has said, vulnerable to radical change? What would it mean to create a social structure that would be possible to be radically changeable? And what kind of an ethics would develop out of that? Moreover, this is not, I emphasize strongly, an argument that therefore we need modernist conceptions to break from traditional ways of thinking. On the contrary, as we've already hinted at last week, some of the most powerful visions that we will be able to use to help in this work actually arose from the so-called traditional world, and they were ones breaking from what they perceived to be a traditional world. So much of our conceptions of world history will also have to be challenged as we do this. Much of those conceptions build in this sense that the world is the world, it is really not changeable. Even our conceptions of modernity, we will see, bizarrely, build in a sense of radical unchangeability. And if we allow some of the most powerful philosophical and religious views from the past to speak, and if we're willing to try to wrestle with them, that might challenge many of our assumptions, including those that we largely take for granted. So it will mean, going back to Roberto's point, we will be breaking from current radically delimited understandings of what philosophy and religion are.
So before going on to describe the dominant way now of studying ethics, which we reject, let me give an example of how in our ethical thinking there can be an interplay between our normative ideas and our ideas about what we're like. Take the conception of freedom, a fundamental conception in our moral and political ideas. What does freedom mean? How do we become free? Now, take the following argument, or claim I'm going to make. There are three main domains in which we achieve or fail to achieve freedom. The first domain has to do with the relation of the self to other people. The second domain has to do with the relation of the self to the society. And the third domain has to do with the relation of the self to itself. What does it mean to be free in our relation to particular other people? Every relation to the others is a threat, jeopardizes us. It contains the threat of subjugation and loss of personal distinction. That's why Sartre said, hell are the others. So how can we shape our relations to others so that in them we are free rather than unfree? There is a threat of subjugation and loss of personal distinction, but we can experience the relation to the other as something that reaffirms us in our sense of being, in our possession of selfhood. Then we would be free. Now, where do we experience that? We have an experience of that in personal love. To say that we love someone is to say that we imagine the other in such a way that the other reinforces us rather than subjugating or diminishing us. There's no loss of personal distinction. But love does not thrive out of the domain of intimacy. Christ commanded us to love the stranger, but it seems that his command in that respect is impossible to perform. And that's why the moral philosophers, like the people whom we'll study today, offer us instead the cold shoulder of an impersonal and altruistic benevolence. It's because we can't have love, or because they think we can't have love. Now, what then is the equivalent to love in life among strangers, not in the sphere of intimacy? The equivalent might be cooperation. Cooperation is the lesser form of love among strangers, after all. The market economy, the market order, could be defined as a simplified form of cooperation that may be unnecessary when there is high trust and is impossible when there is no trust. It was described by the social theorists like Max Weber as a form of life and relationship that requires the generalization of a modicum of trust, a low level of trust among strangers, and therefore its characteristic economic forms, like conventional industry, are command and control, dependent on a low level of trust, a modicum of trust generalized among strangers. A higher form of production and of economic order might require an elevation of the level of trust. So we think that a knowledge economy especially for the many, as opposed to what we have in the world now, which is a knowledge economy for the few, we have as its moral basis an elevation of the level of trust that we can require or expect from all who are engaged in the process of production. But there would be this connection. So, what are the forms of cooperation? That's the object of conflict in history. the most obvious ones are the democracy and the market. But all the particular forms of the market and of the democracy are contested and contestable. That's the fighting that fills up history, the fighting about that. What for? Now, what's the second domain in which we achieve freedom? We achieve freedom in society. No one is free alone in the forest, on the ocean. We're free only by engaging in a particular society. But every engagement seems to require from us, as the price of engagement, that we surrender. So we're not free if we have to choose between non-engagement or isolation and surrender. We're only free if somehow we could engage without surrendering. If we could engage in such a way that we would deny the last word to the society in which we are engaging, and we would continue to resist it. We would resist while engaging, and we would, in a sense, be both insiders and outsiders. Then we would be free. That's the second definition of freedom. And society can be organized in such a way that either makes this possibility of engaging while resisting easier or harder. So you could say that in general there are two categories of moves in the world. There are the routine moves that we make within a framework of arrangements and assumptions that we take for granted. And there are the extraordinary moves by which from time to time, typically under the provocation of crisis, either collective or personal, we challenge and change pieces of that framework of established assumptions and arrangements. Now, these two sets of moves, the routine moves and the sessional or transformative moves, can be closer together or further apart. And society can be so arranged, or culture can be so arranged, that it moves these two sets of moves closer together. And then it helps make us freer. So that's the second domain of freedom. Now there's a third domain of freedom. To be free, we must form a habitual way of acting in the world, or a habitual vision of the world, an understanding of the world. This habitual way of action and understanding is what the Greeks call a character. And they said, character is destiny. So to be free, we must form a routinized version of the self. But this routinized version of the self, the character, this rigidified version of the self, can suck the life out of us. It can become a fetish. It can become the icon to which we then seed our lives. So to be free, we must have this habitual form of action, but we must at the same time be able to disrupt it. We must not allow it to become a mummy that encases us, and within which we die many small deaths. We must be able to break out of the mummy and live in such a form that we die only once. Now that's an example of a conception of freedom, not as an object or a system, but as a set of contradictions. And this set of contradictions is life, in which we are freer or less free, and the role of society on this view is to increase our chances of living a larger life and becoming bigger and freer. That's freedom. So that's a little example of how we can proceed from a dialectical view of who we are and how we become free to a moral vision. Michael.
Sure. So you've already gotten a sense of one of the key themes of this course. So we will be tracing over the next several weeks key themes that arose in early Christianity dealing with love and infinity. We will read some of the early texts in which these are given in incredibly powerful and, because of that reason, impossible understandings. We will then trace, and today we will begin that process, of the ways these ideas have been radically domesticated. Not simply secularized, because you can secularize something and give it incredible power, but also radically delimited and radically domesticated and radically curtailed. In this specific instance, as Roberto has said, love has been transformed into simple altruism, and the vision of infinity, of radical freedom, has been curtailed into sets of rights that a sovereign individual is allowed to exercise in an altruistic framework. The former has taken the form of the kinds of liberalism that we have come to know, and we'll see a version of that when we get to our readings for today. The ethical philosophies based upon how rational agents will deal with each other in a procedurally altruistic way in terms of freedom. We will be looking at a vision of freedom that would mean one is a sovereign individual and can make those decisions rationally as to how procedurally to deal with others around one in an altruistic way. We will see how that plays out in ethical philosophy very soon, and we will discuss how that is part and parcel of the delimited notions of liberalism that we have come to accept. What Roberto is bringing to the table is to say, what if, on the contrary, we turn to these notions of love and infinity, and instead of radically curtailing them into simple visions of altruism and rational individuals with specific rights, we, on the contrary, take seriously what it would mean to build a world and build a social world very much included based upon radically embracing these notions of love and radically embracing these notions of freedom. And to the obvious objection that, well, that's impossible, Roberto was arguing, well, no, the fact that we immediately deem it to be impossible is part of the problem. Why is it that we would deem it to be immediately possible? And what would it mean to break out of that pre-given delimitation and work through the implications of what it would mean? So you're getting a sense of where we're going.
This little discourse about freedom that I just tried out is an example of what I would propose as a model of ethical discourse, ethical reasoning, with a practical conclusion. It's in the service of the idea that the first task is to protect ourselves, to throw down our shields, the idea that I mentioned before. And it arises from the background of ideas like that, about personality and freedom. Now we're going to go to the main subject of today's class, which is what I called the school philosophy, which is the official way of studying ethics. And what is this official way of studying ethics? It was described by many philosophers. You go anywhere especially in the Anglo-American world, and you ask, what is it like to study ethics? You'll find the following. They will tell you that there are three main schools of ethical thinking, which they associate with the names of dead great philosophers. Bentham, Rousseau, and Kant. Without justification, I think, but they usurp the name of these philosophers for their idea of what the schools of ethical thinking are. It's consequentialist, Bentham and his philosophic calculus, the greatest happiness for the greatest number as the objective. Kant, the preference for ideas that you have reason to will to be universalized. And Rousseau, the social contract. You imagine a kind of, an imaginary hypothetical constitutional convention in which you don't know who you will be in the social order that you're creating. And under that veil of ignorance, you establish the neutral principles which will govern society. And what has resulted has been a moralistic legalism. So the school philosophy is the ethics of this moralistic legalism, defined as if it were neutral or obvious. It is, I think, a pharisaical moralistic legalism. With presuppositions that don't correspond to who we are, especially to who we are today. These dead philosophers should not be held responsible for what has resulted. Their ideas were not the ideas of this meta-ethics. Their conception was not that the supreme responsibility of ethics is to teach us our obligations to one another. And that's the theme of this school philosophy. The theme of this school philosophy is there's a book of accounts determining your rights and your liabilities to others, and you have to balance the books. So their campaigns begin and end in hand washing, and their objective, the objective of morality, is to show that you have clean hands, to reach the end of your days with your hands as clean as were the hands of Pontius Pilate after he washed them. That's the objective. Innocence, blamelessness, and that's treated as if it were the universal character of morality. Don't blame these philosophers for that. I've cited before what Bentham wrote in a book of a lady in London Society. He wrote, "The best way to be happy is to make other people happy. The best way to make other people happy is to pretend to love them. And the best way to pretend to love them is to love them in fact." In this way, in just 2 sentences, he went from Benthamism to Christianity. And this is the reality of the philosophers as opposed to the claims of the school philosophy. Which has the same relation to the ideas of the philosophers that the Sadducees and Pharisees of Christ's time had to the Jewish prophets. Now, Derek Parfit, one of the main exponents of this school philosophy, wrote a book called On What Matters. The first 2 volumes in 2011, and the last volume in 2017. And in this book, he proposed to demonstrate that the 3 schools, the deontological, the consequentialist or utilitarian, and the social contract are in fact equivalent. That they're climbing the same mountain from different sides of the mountaintop, but they reach the same result, the same end. And he says, because he belonged to a generation of academics who thought that they were witnessing the assault of historical relativism on moral truth, that they must be valid if everyone holds them. But who were the everyone? The everyone were the provincial exponents of certain ideas in the English-speaking countries in the late 20th who held these views. So they were correct in that sense. And I want to give a different interpretation then of their equivalence. Parfit's thesis of the equivalence. It's not because they are obvious and universally held. They're the provincial, moralistic, legalistic ethic of a particular part of the world. But he is not incorrect that in a sense they are equivalent. They converge to the same kind of view. And now let me say what they have in common. These three schools of ethics studied in the Anglo-American Academy. The first thing that they have in common is a common view of what the problem is. The problem is self-centeredness, narcissism of the ego agent who has to be controlled. The second thing that they have in common is a perspective. Their shared perspective is the perspective of an impersonal benevolence or altruism, opposed to this self-centeredness of the ego agent. The third thing they have in common is a shared view of the work to be done. The work to be done is to develop a moral program which affirms the superiority of this neutral view, this impersonal view, controlling the selfishness. The fourth thing that they have in common, and the one by which they're most known, is the equation of this task with a particular method by which one is to reach this neutral result. The method of Bentham's philosophic calculus, the utilitarian method, conceived typically not as an act utilitarianism, not judging the consequences of particular acts one by one, but a rule utilitarianism. Which rule in the aggregate, which way of dealing in the aggregate with acts promotes the greatest happiness of the greatest number. The method of the categorical imperative, universalizing prescriptions, will only that which you can imagine to be become a universal rule. And third, then, the method of the social contract. In which you imagine yourself in this constitutional convention, in which you don't know your fate, your social fate, and therefore you will try and achieve the result which is most transcendent of your particular interest as a member of a certain class, for example. Now, Kant's categorical imperative was attacked in Germany, famously by Max Scheler, on the ground that you could not deduce, could not infer content from form. And the same thing can be said of the other methods. You can manipulate any of these methods. If you're even an indifferent lawyer, you can produce the rhetoric which will justify under these methods any result that you want. Everyone would know that. Now, the method is so indeterminate in its way of formulating the premises of the method that it can become only determinate if there is a fifth element that they share in common, these two, the fifth element is the identification of the method with an institutional arrangement. And there are two candidates for the institutional arrangement with which the method should be identified. The two candidates are the market or the democracy. Those are the two ways of aggregating individual preferences and choices. And then the problem is that every particular version of the market order, or every particular version of democracy, will be contestable. There won't be any obvious choice. For example, what should, in the market, what should the regime of property be? A market order, even at the highest level of abstraction, has at least two dimensions. One dimension is the number of economic agents able to bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. That's what you would call absolute decentralization. And the other dimension is the degree of control that those agents have over the resources at their disposal. Will that degree of control be perpetual or temporary? Will it be absolute or conditional? Will it be unified or fragmentary? So the market order could have radically different forms. Let me give you a speculative example. You could say, the capital resources of society will not be owned by individuals, nor by the state. They'll be placed in independent funds, and these funds will conduct a permanent auction for the temporary use of the capital resources of society under different conditions. And we'll experiment with what works best. But there'll be a permanent auctioning off of the capital resources of society. No one will hold property perpetually, not because it will belong to the state, but because it won't belong to anyone. Now, that may seem absurd to you, but the fact is that the orthodox theory of finance says that what claims that that's what the market already is. It claims that a perfectly competitive financial market is doing exactly what I said my idealized market would do. It would auction off resources to whoever can use them most effectively. So, for example, it would say with respect to the Russian so-called spontaneous privatization after the fall of the Soviet Union, that turned over the productive resources of the Soviet Union to the Russian oligarchs. It doesn't matter who initially gains control of them, because eventually the control will fall into the hands of the most efficient users, no matter what happened initially. That's the theory. And the institutional fiction that I just cited is simply the embodiment of that theory. It says if that's what capitalism already is, then let's actually have it, literally according to its description. Now, this is the school philosophy, what I've just described. This is the basis of morality that they propose. This moralistic legalism. In what presuppositions? Against what background? So you could say, a historian could say, a historian of our moral ideas, that against the background of early bourgeois Europe, a particular view of humanity. Schopenhauer famously described the condition of humanity in this way. He said, we're like a bunch of porcupines who find themselves in the cold night. The porcupines come closer together, and then they prick each other with their spines. Then they go further apart, and they go constantly, restlessly coming together and further apart. When they're further apart, they become cold. Then they get together to warm themselves, and they hurt one another. And that's us. Until we settle into an uncomfortable middle distance. So the school philosophy is the philosophy of life in this middle distance. Of estrangement and antagonism, and that's us. Or again, Madame de Staël at the start of the 19th century prophesied the emergence of societies that would be prodigal in meetings, that rob us of solitude without affording us company, which is another way to describe this middle distance. The school philosophy is the ethical world of that philosophy. So against what background is it plausible? First, the classical system of private law, the property right, the conventional unified property right, which combines all the powers of property in the same right, unified property, and vests them in the same right owner, in the same right holder, the owner. Within the sphere of property, the individual is sovereign, is absolute. Only when he steps outside the sphere, he becomes vulnerable to the claims of others. And within a system of social life, which is supposedly organized by conventional contracts, the bilateral executory contract, which is a fully articulated bargain for an exchange of performances in the future, as opposed to a relational contract, which is an incomplete contract for a continuing set of exchanges in the future. So it's a society in which property is absolute and unified, and contracts are these arm's length deals for an exchange of performances in the future. Political life, democracy, is shaped by a proto-democratic liberalism, like the arrangements of the American Constitution, in which the objective is to slow politics down, to limit the level of political engagement, and to create in the constitutional order a kind of perpetual motion machine that inhibits the transformation of society by politics. And it is based on the assumption that at the end of the day, we have to choose between a politics that is cold and institutional and a politics that is hot and anti-institutional. In other words, we have to choose between Madison and Mussolini. That's the world to which this school philosophy points. Now, one might say it's an ethics for a vanished world. But you could also say it's an ethics for a world that never existed. And that's what we have by way of ethical study. So the ethical study that exists in the Anglo-American Academy are these three schools, combined with moral casuistry, with the study of these artificial moral dilemmas. They're completely arbitrary, and they have no relation to the organization of social life. Now, before I turn over to Michael again, I can't resist giving an example suggested to me by conversation with a leading American moral philosopher. said, moral dilemmas are intractable, insoluble. Then he gives an example. Your house is burning down. What do you save? Your grandmother or the Picasso?
Wonderful. So let me, again, give a commentary to Roberto to see what he is doing in this point by way of Parfit, why Parfit is seen, he's recently passed away, but was seen as, in some ways, the single greatest Anglo-American philosopher, certainly dealing with ethics, and largely because of this grand 3-volume work in which he solves, in his mind, all ethical problems by showing that the 3, in his opinion, only significant ethical positions all amount to the same thing. Therefore, as Roberto mentioned, this wonderful metaphor he thinks of a mountaintop in which the only 3 significant ethical positions are climbing up the same mountain, and if they can be shown in his great 3-volume work to arrive at the exact same place, that means Parfit's own reworking of the 3 will be true and correct because the 3 positions have been shown to amount to the exact same thing. And he truly did feel, when he finished these 3 volumes, that he had solved the ethical problems of the world, and hence the title of the book. This is what really matters. This explains how to act in the world. I'm sure, reading the summary, this is his summary, you felt the exact same way that all possible ethical problems were solved.
He had succeeded because in the last volume,
That's right.
which he published in 2017, he said, it's strange that in a work called On What Matters, I have not said anything about what really matters. And he made that comment because he was a proponent of this radical altruism.
Yes, yes.
Like the School of American Effective Altruism, it's called, now popular among financiers and entrepreneurs. That's what really matters, to be an altruist. A Christian thinks that what matters is to love. And to enact one's transcendent. Well,
Let's open this up. Your thoughts on Parfit, but of course on any aspect of what we've discussed so far.
I have to, I guess it must be implicit in this argument of mine. I think this idea of morality is revolting. Life is a book of accounts, with credits and liabilities, with rules. If anyone were really like that, so the person, the objective is, I'm innocent. I can stand in the front rows of the church and the temple, raise my arms to the supreme judge of the world, who's the embodiment of my moral severity, and say, am I not blameless? Am I not innocent? What a monster. If we could find such a person, we would consign him to the flames.
And it is, just to underline the point, stunning that Parfit, who was a really brilliant human being, could write a book truly thinking he had solved all problems, not realizing the flip side of that is, of course, he is simply taken as Roberto.
Our real target here is not Parfit. Our real target here is the philosophy, the official philosophy.
Exactly.
The official philosophy of the academy.
Precisely.
Which is a degradation
Exactly.
of the vocation of philosophy. And
Yes.
so I said, philosophy has a revisionist vocation, it's a mind at war. It's the exact opposite. This is, let's organize this as a campaign to demonstrate our innocence, that we're blameless, and then everything will continue the same. But we'll be saved. Hypocrites.
Yes. Please, yes.
Within the context of today's discussion, where does free will fit in?
Oh, what about free will?
In what respect, how are you thinking?
We spoke a lot about freedom.
Yes.
We spoke about the integration of freedom
Yeah.
in society. I'm just wondering, and we spoke about faith. I'm just wondering, does free will fit in any of your discussion?
Well, it is presupposing, the whole argument is presupposing this potential for agency that we have, that we can turn the tables on the social order, and that the extent to which we have, quote, free will or not, is variable. That we can construct a world in which we become more capable of exercising this agency. Whatever the retrospective metaphysical description is, that we had or not freedom to do these things, in practice, we can increase or diminish our power of agency. So it's putting aside the scientific or metaphysical assumptions about free will and supposing that in practice we can rearrange things to increase our free will. It is assuming that. And that this practical demonstration of our power to turn the tables on the social order is what we really mean by free will, whatever the ultimate scientific or metaphysical description is. So a pragmatic reduction of the traditional dispute about free will. Free will then is a matter of the institutions which enable us or not to turn the tables in this way and affirm our agency. As opposed to the claim that it's all predetermined in a way which we couldn't notice.
Here first and then here. Yes, please.
You talked about the meaning of freedom in relation of self to self,
Yes.
right? And it was like, from what I understood, and important to understand correctly, is to create a routinized version of oneself, right? Character.
I think so. So imagine, for example, take an aspect of Nietzsche's description of autonomy or self-destruction. The individual makes his life into a work of art. He spends his life perfecting this statue. And the statue is himself. So what I'm saying is that this idea of aesthetic unity or perfection of the self, constructing this routinized version of me, is not freedom. Because we have to have coherence in our way of operating in the world and seeing the world. But we also have to be capable of disrupting it. This is, I think, the common modernist presupposition now. We all think that way. So it's not I don't intend it as a controversial claim. I intend it as a description of our common way of thinking now about individual agency. We can't think of ourselves as a machine. And that relates to a dispute about how we organize practical freedom in the world. So suppose, take the issue of technology. And one way of thinking about technology is, technology marks the movable frontier between what we already know how to repeat and what we don't yet know how to repeat. So everything that we know how to repeat, we can express in a formula or an algorithm. And then we can embody the formula or the algorithm in a mechanical device. From that standpoint, the point of the machine is to allow us to preserve our supreme and, in a sense, our only resource, which is our time, for the not yet repeatable. The point of the machine is to do for us what we have learned how to repeat so that we can be the not yet repeatable. So the partnership of the machine with the anti-machine, who is the worker with imagination, is in principle much more powerful than the machine alone or the worker alone. So now, how would we apply that to society? We would say, if we were to have a knowledge economy for the many, rather than what we have, which is an insular knowledge economy, a knowledge economy for the few, one of its conditions is altering the evolutionary logic in the development of technology. So the logic that's now established is a logic that develops the technologies of artificial intelligence in a form that is most capable of assimilation by the largest firms with the biggest pools of capital. That second takes as the middle term criterion of development automation, that is the substitution of the worker rather than the equipment of the worker. And that defines as the ultimate objective, the long-term objective, general artificial intelligence, which means forming a machine which is a simulacrum of the human mind. The closer the machine is to us, the better, supposedly. The alternative view is, no, we want a logic in the evolution of technology that prioritizes the use of the machines by the backward, small and medium-sized firms of the peripheral economy, by the mass of individualized economic agents, who now are a major part of the labor force in every country in the world. For example, the nurse practitioner who acquires the powers of a physician through the use of artificial intelligence. Then the second level, we want an evolution of the technology that rejects automation as a midterm objective and instead defines empowerment and equipment of the worker. And third, in the future, we don't want the machine to be a proxy for the human mind. We want to form the general machine which will be as different as possible from the mind. So it will have the powers that we lack, computational powers, but it will be able to interact with us. And our duo with the machine will be more powerful than either alone. So what do we have? We can have vision, imagination, which the machine lacks. But the machine is much more powerful than us. So Schopenhauer defined, contrasted the genius with a talented person in this way. He said, the talented person is a marksman who hits a target that others cannot hit. The genius is a marksman who hits a target that others cannot see. Now, what is our objective in the long term? Our objective is the diffusion of the experience of genius in the mass of humanity. And that goes to the question that you raised about free will. That's the practical definition of free will. Because we don't have or lack eternally the power of agency. We can construct it, but it depends on things like the property regime or the evolution of technology. This is what real morality and real politics should be about. And that, it shouldn't be about the book of accounts. And its objective should not be to make us feel blameless before we die. Transformative power is more important than innocence.
Yes, please.
So when you're characterizing the philosophies and ideologies that you see as unimaginative and complacent and small-minded, it sounds as if you're sort of relegating classical liberalism to one such philosophy. But could one not argue that classical liberalism, certainly at the time of Locke, Jefferson, and Mill, and perhaps today, epitomizes much of what you're talking about in terms of being radical?
Well, this is a long discussion, but let me anticipate one aspect. Because the most important proposition of classical political liberal theory is that we can distinguish between the right and the good. In other words, the objective of classical liberalism is to create a system of institutions and of laws that is neutral with respect to sectarian views of the good, so that people with classing religious and moral convictions can live peacefully together within the same framework. Historically, that was the central objective of classical liberalism. Now, what's the problem? The problem is that there is no neutral principle. There is no neutral framework. Every institutional framework tilts the scales in favor of some forms of experience and agency and against others. And the invocation of neutrality is always in the service of its opposite. That is, by calling a system, a framework of institutions and principles neutral, we immunize it against attack. We lift it above the fray. So it's the opposite of what it claims to be. Nevertheless, and now comes the second move in the argument, nevertheless, the false claim of neutrality has a kinship with another idea which is valid and which is legitimate. It has a kinship with a set of institutions which is open to a large range of contradictory experience and has the attribute of corrigibility, that is, that we can correct it in the light of experience. That's better than neutrality. That's real, whereas neutrality is false and illusory. So that's another theory, which is not completely unrelated to classical liberalism, but replaces neutrality by corrigibility and contradiction. That's superior. So one of the problems of classical liberalism is its institutional dogmatism. So, like the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we have reason to affirm the superiority of structural solutions and structural alternatives to non-structural ones, and to dispute the claim of any version of the market or of democracy to be neutral. So we have a problem or a task without historical precedent, which is how to affirm the priority of structural alternatives without succumbing, as the 19th century liberals and socialists did, to a structural dogmatism. Because that's what they were like. They said, here's my system of rights. The liberal system of rights are the opposite, the socialist system of rights. Follow me and you'll become both free and rich. And now we know that it's not like that. that every dogmatic trajectory is then the disorientation of society, the loss of the actual dream of freedom. That's how I would begin the argument about this point. I would say, experimentalism, we want democratic experimentalism. We don't want liberal dogmatism. The problem with the liberal theory was its equation of its dreams, of its beliefs, which it canonized in the notion of neutrality to the particular institutional arrangements, a particular regime of property. So, classic unified private property has a great advantage. It has one great virtue, which it allows someone, the owner, to do at his own risk something that no one else believes in. That's the virtue of the classic system of absolute private property. So we would never want an economic order that doesn't have that, but we would never want that to be the only form of the decentralization of property. The main form of the decentralization of property should allow challengers to the incumbents to acquire at least the temporary use of the capital resources of society and to demonstrate by that temporal use that they can do better than the people who had it before. That's what we would want. So my proposal is not to reject completely the liberal principles. It's to subordinate them to an experimental alternative.
Yes, please.
One of the ways you describe freedom is as engaging institutions without surrendering to them.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Sorry, one of the ways
So talk loud, shout.
one of the ways you describe freedom is as engaging institutions without surrendering to them, or like
What does it
resisting
mean?
resisting while participating, because you said society.
What does it mean in practice? It means that to be a member of a society, of a culture, I don't have to give myself to it. This is the heresy of the anthropologist. That the real entities in world history are these cultures, or these collective identities. So they should be preserved. Now, I'm a Brazilian. In my country, one of the problems we have are the Indian peoples in the Amazon. And so they have a large part of territory of land, but they're sinking into depression, into drug addiction, because they have no economic and educational opportunities. So we have to learn how to give them opportunities without predetermining the outcome of assimilation or not by the way in which we provide them with opportunities. But there's another problem, and the other problem is, what should be the attitude of the Republic to the individual Indian young person? The Indian young person is a citizen of the Republic. Now suppose he wants to smash the idols of the tribe. The Republic should stand by him and provide him with the instruments for smashing as part of his freedom. And not take him to be just an example of the tribe. That's the dispute. So, to be free, I say, you have to be able to engage in a collective world. You can't be free alone, but you have to have a form of engagement which allows you to continue resisting and protesting while you engage. Resisting is not the opposite of participating. Participating shouldn't mean allowing the collective form to have the last word. Keep the last word for yourself while you're engaging. That's a secular account of the Christian injunction to be in the world without being of it. And that's what we should all want.
question about something from the reading. I was a little bit confused on the distinction between like indirect consequentialist and direct consequentialist. Just because I understood it as like consequentialist theory is seeking an impartial best outcome for the collective, but I was just a little bit
You
confused
mean
on that.
act versus rule utilitarianism? In other words, it's not, you don't assess the consequences act by act, but in rules governing the acts. But that's an example of how manipulable these things are, right? That with each of these methods on which the school philosophy focuses, you can spin them to achieve whatever result you want. I mean, for example, take the social contract and its imaginary constitutional convention. It's only going to produce results if it has a content. You have to characterize what the people know enough to be able to explain how they would reach any conclusion. They may not know their own individual fates, but they must know something about the typical course of a human life. And what will be these assumptions? So each of these methods in practice can be deployed only by stipulating certain boundary conditions or assumptions that they'll have that will allow them to reach results. Now, because that operation is always unclear or ambiguous, the method has to have an institutional representative. It's never enough to say there'll be just this method, because you know that as a lawyer or a rhetorician, you could spin the method to mean whatever you want. So then the solution to that problem is to identify the method with an institutional arrangement. The market or democracy, political or economic, some way of aggregating choices. And that's what allows it to have concrete results. But then you simply transfer the dispute change the dispute into a contest over the institutions, instead of being a contest over the method. But it's the same contest. So it's like a magic operation in which the magic is fishing.
Yeah, I have a question about how you see philosophies like Confucian or Taoist thought kind of interacting and responding to these unimaginative philosophies. In that it seems like
Confucianism and Taoism.
yeah, because it seems, at least to me, that Confucian and Taoist thought are often about breaking pattern thinking, and I guess with these unimaginative philosophies,
I
they're
think
so
there's total
entrenched.
rejection to this way of thought. I think any of the theories, any of the moral philosophies that we'll be considering later in this semester make claims and assumptions about who we are. And their whole object is different. Their object is not to teach us what we owe other people, what our obligations are, how we can balance our moral books. Their object is to teach us how we can ascend as individuals and as societies to a higher form of life, how we can become bigger, greater, with a life with more scope, with more intensity. That's the object. And it's a move in a different game. It has altogether a different object. That's why we have trouble answering you directly, because I would say they characterize the problem of ethics in a completely different form. They don't characterize the problem as a problem of forming neutral principles, the argument we were just having about liberalism. Everyone understands that there are no neutral principles, but that's not the end of the story. That's just the beginning of the story. So principles there are no neutral principles, but there are principles and institutions that can become progressively less sectarian. In other words, neutrality is not the point of departure, it's the point of arrival. That's another way of saying it.
Please.
Okay, your model of philosophy is the mind at war, right? In what realm does that operate outside the individual?
Outside what?
Well, how do you envision the context for the mind, your model of
So
philosophy?
I think philosophy, unlike one of the distinctions between philosophy and religion, is that philosophy is still a matter of individuals, right? So religion always has this collective element. There are schools of philosophy, but the philosophers appear still as individuals, both in the East and in the West.
Well, that's what I'm getting at. It's an individual endeavor, this model of philosophy that you're talking about.
Philosophy are ideas, right? Robert Musil, who wrote A Man Without Qualities, said, the philosophers are despots without armies. So they're these individual despotic challengers or defenders of the existing order. That's what we've inherited until we change it. But philosophy is an activity at the margins of society, with the advantages and disadvantages of the marginated, of the marginal. It's not a collective activity. It can require collective force. So they asked the Europeans, who was the greatest philosopher in modern history? And the answer was Karl Marx. So implicit in the answer that they gave to the question, who was the greatest philosopher, was an idea that philosophy should not be just individual. Because Marx is admired, because although he worked as an individual, his name is then associated with these momentous collective events. It wasn't obvious at the time. So, Das Kapital, which was his major intellectual achievement, sold 200 copies in the first 20 years after it was published. And look what happened later. So you would say, well, that's individual philosophy, but it became something later. So that's a seductive model, but it's an extraordinary exception of the use of ideas to start a fire in the world. Our whole course here is about, so the reason why my answer to you is difficult and unsatisfactory. The topic looked at from a certain angle is, the last 3 centuries, the world has been on fire, right? It's a revolutionary period. And this revolution that has been going on in the world has 2 sides. It has a political side and it has a personalist side. The political side is the side supported by the doctrines of democracy, of liberalism, and of socialism. The personalist side, and the message is, will lift the grid of division and hierarchy, weighing on social life, and liberate humanity from the servitude class structure. The personalist side is carried by the Romantic movement, and especially by the worldwide popular Romantic culture. With its message that the ordinary man and woman are not so ordinary after all, but they carry within them the seed of divinity. They can be lifted up. The aim of the progressives was never just to humanize society. The aim was to divinize humanity. That's the personal side. Now this project, this revolutionary project that has been going on in the world for 3 centuries now, remains the strongest project in the world. Not because it's the only project, it has many enemies, but all of its enemies respond to it. So it continues to command the agenda. But it's at the same time weak because its votaries, its supporters, no longer know what its next steps should be, either in form or in content. So from my standpoint, the focus of this class is on the personalist side, not on the political side of this revolutionary project. And so I'm not satisfied with the answer that's just an individual concern. It has to do with this collective experience, this revolutionary experience. And with the next steps on the personalist side of this project, we can, so my attitude is, I want the revolution to continue. And my sense is that my life fell in a counter-revolutionary interlude in this long revolutionary period in the life of humanity. I don't want my ideas or my deeds to be shaped by the biases of the counter-revolutionary interlude. I want to reinvent the revolution in form and in content so that it can continue, because it's subject to the law of the spirit, which is that we can possess only when we resign, only when we renounce and reimagine. So, although I'm admitting that it takes still an individual form, I'm expressing now through the way in which I answer you my hope that it's collective, that it's social.
Well, you answered, I was wondering how it led to the engagement you're talking about.
You see the contradictions in which I involve myself when I try and give a better answer.
Thank you.
Please.
Michael, I wonder if you could kind of comment on, in with Confucianism and Chinese context, how the different terms of philosophy and religion might not map on so perfectly, and how Confucianism arguably is both philosophy and religion, but also neither. I'm just curious, like, how do you define, or like what other, are there better words or ways to think about the division in Confucian context?
Sure.
Can you restate the question?
Oh, yes, so the question was, how would Confucianism be situated within definitions of philosophy and religion? Yep, I will say a few words, and then please take over. So in an exciting way, I think it fits very poorly into neither of our current definitions of philosophy and religion. So certainly the very restricted vision of philosophy that we've been critiquing today, absolutely. Confucianism, this is equally going to be true of Buddhism, Christianity. None of the visions that we're talking about fit well within that. I would even say early Greek philosophy doesn't either, even though obviously it's a Greek word, but when they were calling themselves philosophers, they meant something far more dramatic than the way we have delimited that term to mean. And as Roberto has mentioned, even the term religion as we use it now, we're really thinking about Protestant visions of an individual having a sincere, direct relationship with God. That's a significant position, and it's not unique to Protestantism. It plays out elsewhere in world religions too, but it usually plays out, and this is certainly true of Protestantism, in response to, a strong reaction against would be a better way of putting it, very different types of religious activities. And so here too, most of the religions of the world do not fit terribly well within our current use of the term religion. And getting back to the heart of your question, that is absolutely true of Confucianism. So it is certainly not a philosophy in a restricted way of thinking about it, nor is it a religion in a more restricted way of thinking about
And
it.
indeed,
Yes.
I think there are, for example, students of Islam who say Islam is not a religion.
Yes.
Because they're impressed by the link of the category of religion in the West
Yes.
with this model of 18th and 19th century Protestantism.
Yes.
So
Yes.
religion is something private, an organized church,
Yes.
and the privatization of the sublime.
Yes.
But of the things that we describe as religion, the majority are not like that at all.
Absolutely.
So this is just the effect of this historically provincial phenomenon
Yes.
on our vocabulary.
Yes. And the dangerous part of this, among other dangerous parts of it, is the fact that we have these delimited definitions of philosophy and religion often mean that we read all of these different things that we call philosophical and religious around the world in these delimited ways. Islam being one of many examples one could give. And so one of the things we'll be trying to do in this class is not allow these definitions to restrict our reading. So when we turn to early Christianity, when we turn to Confucianism, when we turn to Buddhism, when we bring in other traditions, we will intentionally try not to allow our restricted definitions to stop us. And then getting to the final part of your question, when you said, well, what word should we use? We will, as you've already begun seeing, still happily use the word philosophy, but our goal will be to dramatically enhance the understandings of what that would be. And this is equally going to hold true for religion. If that concept does not account for most of what goes on, let's expand it.
I think that the problem that I label the cognitive gap presents itself much more dramatically in religion than in philosophy.
Absolutely.
Because the philosophers have to be candid in acknowledging the relative force of their ideas and their arguments.
Exactly.
And in religion, especially when we're gripped by religious enthusiasm, we have to bet our existence on something that we know we can't demonstrate. And so, on the one hand, the prize is much larger, the whole direction of individual and collective life. And the basis for our commitment is much more obviously insecure. And that radical contrast is not manifest in any other aspect of our thinking.
Absolutely. I mean, it's telling that in a course that we will generally call a philosophy course, a lot of our readings will actually be things that would much more commonly and much more correctly in some ways be classified as religion. And we are very happy with that fact. Yes. But again, in both cases, we will be trying to dramatically expand our understandings.
But the claim underlying the idea of the cognitive gap is that the question, how are we to live, is the only question that we cannot fail to answer. Because we will answer it one way or the other by the way in which we live. And that problem does not present itself in that way in philosophy. So we have this limited time. We're all dying organisms in a world which we don't understand. And what are we going to do in that meantime? That's very definitively something from which we cannot escape. So we can close the book of philosophy and say, we don't want to deal with these abstractions and speculations that we can't answer. But we can't close the other book. The other book is the one we can't close. To that one, we'll have to give an answer one way or the other.
And that is a perfect place to close our discussion for today. Let me make one quick logistical comment. One of our students, I'm so sorry, I don't know your name. John, great. So John would like to, this is completely voluntary, organize a reading group that would meet probably here, although if this changes, we'll let you know, at 3 o'clock on Wednesday. So in other words, right here before class begins, the goal of this would just be to have a pre-class discussion of the readings for that week. So if you'd like to join, totally voluntary. It will be held, unless there's further notice, here at 3 o'clock every Wednesday. Again, we might be able to find a nicer seminar room than this for a smaller group, so we'll let you know if the group changes, but tentatively here at 3 o'clock. Great, thank you. And thank you all so much for the discussion. We will see you next week. Thank you. Post-it.